Okay, thank you everyone for joining us for As you know, we have one more book clearance left in this year's series. And I'm very excited to have her here with us today. She is a Kirkus Award winning author, and she is going to be reviewing her book, her second book today. And she is several miles away from us. And I'm going to get started. And if you, Pearl, if you can't hear us for any reason, please let me know, and I'll grab a mic from outside so that you can hear the audience a little bit.
Okay, thanks. I can hear you. It's a little jumbled, but not too bad.
Okay. Please feel free to get started.
Okay. I'm Pearl Whitfield. I live in Eastern Oregon, where it's probably just as cold as where you are. I think we're going to get all the way up to 36 degrees today. And the Canada geese have just come back and they're flying up onto the rimrock above the house as I was waiting for the meeting to start. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank particularly Alexis, who has kind of shepherded me through this process ever since I came to Canandaigua last spring on a book tour. I didn't know if one of you had read the book and was going to give a review at the start. Did I misunderstand that, Alexis?
Yeah, no, if you want to give a brief review of the book,
Okay.
some people in the audience may not have read or some may have. So.
Okay. This is my second book. It's called Aspara, and you probably have seen it. I don't know if that comes out okay. Is it backwards on yours? It's backwards on mine.
Good.
Okay, and it's the story of a little girl in Cambodia in the 12th century who loves to dance, and she is chosen to dance for the most famous king in Cambodian history, King Jayavarman VII. Cambodia at the time covered all of Southeast Asia, except for most of Burma was on its own, and a little bit of Laos, all of Thailand, all of Vietnam, almost all of Laos was included in his kingdom. And he built one of the biggest temples, actually it is the biggest temple, in the Angkor Wat complex. Everybody has heard of Angkor Wat, and many people have seen the pictures of the temple that has faces on each side of every tower. And there are many, many towers. And I can't remember exactly how many, but it's in the historical notes at the back of the book. I think what I'll do is I'll start by reading just a little section from the first chapter. So Bopa is the name of the little girl, and they've had the dance concert and she's been accepted to go, and it means leaving her village and going to train at Angkor Wat to dance for the king. Bopa woke in the dark. She could hear her father's slight snore, her brother's quiet sleeping breaths. Rizme was curled into her on the small pallet they shared. Even though she couldn't see, Bopa knew from the sound that Rizme had 2 fingers in her mouth. She listened, but couldn't hear her mother. Gently and silently, Bopa uncurled from Rizme and stood. The birds were still sleeping, but night insects hummed and creaked. A toque suddenly squawked loudly, "Toque!" under her feet, and Bopa caught her breath involuntarily, even though she knew the sound well. A big one lived in the beams under the floor, a sign that their home was blessed. Was that what had woken her? She could see a little in the dimness now and made her way around her sleeping family. Ndea wasn't in her spot next to Opuk. Popa lifted the cloth that covered the door. Slipping outside, she stopped. There was a dark shadow in the courtyard. When a cloud lifted from the half-moon sky, Popa could see the shadow was Mde kneeling at the family altar under their big neem tree. She smelled incense. She climbed quietly down the ladder and joined her mother, who glanced at her, then closed her eyes again, hands in sampeya at her forehead. The ground was cool and gritty under Popa's knees. Ndea had put a stick of precious incense into the clay pot filled with sand, which sat on the painted wooden platform of their family altar. She could make out in front of the incense a small banana and a white lump on a banana leaf, which was likely rice. Her mother was making a special offering, but why in the middle of the night? She knew better than to interrupt her mother's silent prayer. After what seemed like ages, when the incense was nearly burned down to the sand, Mdea took a deep breath and lowered her hands. Why are you up in the middle of the night? She looked at her daughter. In the moonlight, Popa saw tears gleaming in her eyes. I just woke up. I don't know why. Why are you making an offering in the middle of the night? Popa asked. When everyone gets up, I will be too busy, Mdea said, pulling Popa so close she could feel the new baby jumping in Mdea's tummy. She laughed quietly. The baby is jumping. Is he happy to be outside with you in the night? Ndea smiled and released her daughter. This is a very busy baby, he or she. I will miss your help. Popa could see the smile fade as she said it. But what are you praying for? Popa asked. I'm asking Buddha and all the gods and all the spirits of the forest to protect you on your journey and in your new life, Mdea said. Popa had forgotten. Even when Mdea said she would miss her help, Popa hadn't remembered. But now she did and felt like she had when the water buffalo calf ran into her. Her chest was tight. I don't want to leave you, she whispered. I know, Mdea said, hugging her again. It's a big honor to be chosen to dance for the king, but it's a big change to leave here. Can't I stay? Popa was begging, tears pouring down her face. She could feel Mdea shake her head. It will be better for you if you go. At first, it will be hard and you will miss us, but you will be so happy to be a dancer and you will meet new friends. Imagine seeing the temples of Angkor. Popa had, of course, heard about Angkor. Her oldest brother said it was only half a day's walk to the big road that led there. He told her about the 5 tall towers and all the monks who lived there. Their village had only a very small wat with 3 monks. One was so old and shriveled that Popa didn't know how he could even walk. Their house was close to the wat, and the old monk would stagger into their yard every morning and hold out his bowl in trembling hands. Ndea always saved a special treat for him, maybe pouring sugar syrup onto rice or giving him 2 of the sweet little bananas Popa loved so much. Can I come back to visit? She asked. Maybe, said Ndea, getting to her feet. That would be nice. I'd love to hear all your adventures. As long as they were already outside, they went to the bushes before climbing the ladder. By now, Popa could see the sky had gotten much lighter with pink streaks in the gray. Let's start cooking now, she said to her mother. I don't think I can go back to sleep. Me either, Ndea said, smiling a little. Good idea. They worked quietly, the tasks known so well they didn't need more light. Popa got some twigs from the firewood pile. Ndea squatted by the pot that kept the embers overnight in a bed of ash. She scooped out layers of ash, then carefully lifted a few chunks and put them in the fire pit. She blew gently, and the chunks went pink, then orange. Popa carefully laid the twigs in a crisscross pattern over the chunks, while Ndea continued to blow until there were a few tiny flickers of flame on the twigs. Popa brought bigger sticks. While Popa blew on the fire and fed it more wood, Ndea dipped water from the cistern. She got rice from the big covered storage basket. It was now less than a quarter full. She hoped the gods would bless them with a good harvest by the time the new baby was eating. with Bopa gone to the king, there would be one less mouth to feed. Until then. It gives you a sense of village life and why a family might be willing to send a child away for a better life, which I think happens even now in many countries in the world. Does anybody have questions to start with?
How did you familiarize yourself with the culture? How did you learn about it? And did you research it or did you live there or?
That's a very good question. Thank you. My daughter has been living in Cambodia for about 12 or 13 years, and I went to visit her shortly after she moved there. And I went to the temples I was going for 4 or 5 days. Most people go for 2 or 3 days. And I ended up being so taken with it that I stayed for 3 weeks, and I went day after day after day to the temples. There are bas-reliefs that in most of the temples depict scenes from Hindu mythology, because Angkor Wat is Hindu, and then from the battles of Jayavarman 7 in Bayon temple, the one with all the faces. One huge long corridor at Bayon has daily life. It has the life of everyday people. So you can learn quite a bit about how life was in the 12th century from just looking at those bas-reliefs. If you go, I recommend getting a guide who can help interpret what's going on. The other thing that is the source for almost everybody is an emissary from China went to Kampuchea, to the empire that Jayavarman had built. And he went about 90 years or 70 years after Jayavarman's death. I figured that there probably wasn't that much change in their culture in that time. So some of what I've written is based on his reports, because in Cambodia, I don't think anybody really knows what happened, but if it wasn't chiseled in stone, it was taken over by the jungle in the 1,000 years since it was one of the biggest cities in Southeast Asia. So nothing survives from that time unless it was chiseled in stone. This emissary from China, Zhu Daguan, I can't pronounce Khmer and I can't pronounce Chinese. So I ask for your, if you can speak either one, cut me some slack. So he wasn't just interested in court life. He was interested in everyday life. He was interested in the markets. He was interested in weddings and funerals and how everyday people lived and how they interacted, who owned businesses. So he sent those, he was there for a year, and he wrote very detailed reports on every aspect of Cambodian life. And those reports he sent back to China, and China did know how to take care of paper and has known for many years before that. So China has written records from 2,000 years ago that they have been able to maintain. So that's where most of the information comes from. There's a lot of archaeology being done, but the archaeology is based on what's left from the jungle. So it's stone or metal. And actually most of the metal was removed by looters over the course of 1,000 years. There's another temple that I had read about in, there's a newspaper on the West Coast called the Asian Reporter, and I had been reading it for years, and I saw that they'd found a new temple because everything was covered by jungle, so nobody really knew what was there. But they found a new temple called Bante Chma that is north of Siem Reap, where Angkor Wat is, and close to the Thai border. And it's almost as big as Angkor Wat itself, but it was not. It has just barely begun to be reclaimed. And when I went there, there was only one other person there, I mean, in a whole day. We had to hunt up the caretaker in order to pay my $5 so I could get in and wander around these huge grounds. So that's another thing. And I also spent quite a bit of time in villages, driving around I had a tuk-tuk driver who took me to a lot of different places. And you can tell as you drive along that life hasn't changed in the 1,000 years. Really, the way they build the houses, you'll have, really kind of old-fashioned traditional houses right next to new houses, more modern houses, and people keep their water in big, huge clay cisterns, big, huge clay jugs near the house. So, and, there's good luck finding a bathroom if you break down at the side of the road. There will be houses and maybe a little store, but there's not a bathroom. So one time during that same trip, I actually went to Burma, and I was trying to go, I wanted to go to the Himalaya Mountains on the border of Burma, Myanmar, and Bangladesh and India and Nepal. And the government wouldn't let me get there. So I went as far north as I could. And then I flew back from a very small airport. And the people there went behind a mat. There was a woven bamboo mat hanging from 2 sticks. And that's where people who were waiting for the plane went to the bathroom. So that's, I think, a pretty ancient way of handling the problem of modesty. So I drew from experience, and I also drew from research. How many people have had a chance to read the book, or is it your first time learning about it? Anybody read? Has anybody read it?
No.
All right. Okay. Cool. Well, thank you for coming. The other thing, I couldn't help writing it. I mean, it started as just a little germ of an idea that was actually a very potent experience that I had after I'd spent all those weeks at the temples. And I just had this really clear image, more than an image, more almost like an experience of a woman standing on the top balcony at Bayonne, the top level, the top tier. In those days, you could go up there. It's now been closed off. You can't get up there anymore. But you climb up these very steep, narrow stairs. And this woman was standing. She was a dancer. I knew she was a dancer, and she was standing on the on the balcony, leaning against the balustrade. And in the courtyard below, it was dark, but people were working. There were torches, and people were preparing for her husband's funeral. And I knew that she had been married to the king, and she did not know what was going to happen to her now that he was dead, because his other wives and his son, who was going to become king, hated her. And so that's where the book started. And I kind of worked back from there, wondering how did she get there? What had her life been like? And some writers use a storyline, they have everything outlined in advance. But I'm one of those writers I may have a few ideas about what may happen. I just, like in that case, I knew how it was going to end, but I didn't know anything else. And so I worked back, then I just sat down with an empty page. I wrote what I knew about the end, and then just sat with the page and asked the question, how did this woman get there? Where did she start? What was her life like? And words came forth to answer the questions. So, and then I would do research. If I ran into a place that I really had no idea what was happening, I would do research to see how, what did happen in that time. So it's a combination of, I guess you'd say, the muse and research. And spending a lot of time. I mean, my daughter's had a baby, so I go to Cambodia for five months every year and spend quite a bit of time, in just people are very, very nice there, very sweet. When you go to the grocery store, this is Sampeya. It's kind of, many people know the gesture. If you do yoga, it's in Hindu, it's, I salute the God within you. And in Cambodia, it's used as sort of a universal greeting and thank you gesture. And if you go to the grocery store and the clerk hands you your, they hand you your change, they give you Sampeya. It's a very ancient tradition that's alive and well in Cambodia. Cambodia was Hindu until Jayavarman was converted by his first wife. There's some things we know because, it's chiseled in stone. We know that he built hundreds and hundreds of miles of roads. He built bridges, he built temples, he built hostels along the roads so that travelers could stay, and they were also used as hospitals. So we know he did all those things because of the record. And I think they're finding more. I don't know exactly how they use satellite imagery, but there's a lot in archaeology where they can find things now a little less hit or miss. But he had roads that went all over the kingdom, he built temples in Thailand that are still being discovered. Quite an amazing guy. He didn't come to power until he was 50, and he died at 90. So I had a little bit of trouble with that because, the dates are a little uncertain. When did he, when was he born? Within, 3 to 5 years. When did he come to power? That's a little more certain. And it's pretty clear the year he died. But he was close to 90. So.
I have another question. Are there very many tourists to Cambodia? And you mentioned that people are kind, but are they receptive to visitors? And I had a third question. Are there still dancers that dance in the traditional ways that your character did?
The traditional dance, I'll start with the traditional dance, was used until the Khmer Rouge came through in the 1970s, and they killed several million people. That was actually, Khmer Rouge was a group. It's kind of a long political story that I won't get into. They were Cambodian, and they killed anybody who could read, anybody who wore glasses, which implied they could read, anybody who was a teacher, anybody who could speak another language, which was difficult because the French had been there for a long time, and a lot of people spoke French and Cambodian, which is called Khmer. It was really a horrible time in the country. So people who could fled the country. There were refugee camps along the borders. Anybody who is 40 or older has experienced, and actually probably more like 35 or older, has experienced either the period of genocide themselves, or they were Khmer Rouge. For example, most of the government was Khmer Rouge. They saw the writing on the wall and they converted to, oh, we think the Khmer Rouge are bad. And so, yeah, we'll help you now, when the UN was starting to come in. And so the prime minister and all of the top ministers in his age bracket were actually Khmer Rouge. The fighting didn't stop in the northwestern provinces until the late 80s. There are landmines all over, some from the Khmer Rouge, some from the Vietnam War. So the country has a lot of problems related to the wars that happened on its own soil and foreign wars. Also, because they killed people who could teach, nobody was educated. They took anybody who was and also if you were a business person, they would take your business and then they would put you to work in a field out in the country where you didn't know what you were doing. So people starved because they had no idea. They thought the idea of the Khmer Rouge is, peasants are better than anybody else, so everybody should be a peasant, except that they didn't know how to grow food. So people starved, many people starved, and children not only did not have any education because the teachers had all been killed, but they also lacked critical brain nutrients during the time that their brains were developing, particularly for logical thinking. And that's led to a lot of problems with the country because people weren't educated and they all had PTSD and they can't think because their brains lacked both education and nutrients to provide, the biochemicals you need for critical thinking. So I guess what I was trying to do with the book, I couldn't really help writing it because it came to me, but was to encourage people to think about going to Cambodia. There were a lot of tourists before COVID. Most of them would fly to Siem Reap to see Angkor Wat. They would spend a day or two at the temples and then they would fly off. They might have a 10-day tour of Southeast Asia and they would go to, Hanoi and Angkor Wat and Bangkok and, maybe some temples in Thailand. But not too many people ever spent a lot of time in Cambodia. So it's actually kind of an interesting place to go because it's, I don't know, authentic isn't the word. Angkor Wat has been purchased. The government sold it to the Chinese. So it is owned and operated by China at this point. And they had, thousands and thousands and thousands of Chinese tourists that would come. So people are just starting to come back to Cambodia. It's kind of hard still to get, it's really difficult to find cheap tickets to get there.
It must take 20 hours, 24 hours of flight time?
Well, it's about 30, if you're lucky, it's a 30-hour transit from Seattle. And, the actual flight time, I think, is maybe 18 of those, and the rest is, waiting for your flight. So it's not, going to Asia is not insignificant. You really, I like to travel by going someplace and staying. And so if I possibly can, that's what I do. Especially if I'm going to go for a long way, I'd like to stay and, hang around and get to know the people and see what it's like. I'm very lucky that my daughter lives there, so I can stay there.
Are they receptive to Americans?
Yes, they
Right.
are. Yes, yeah. They definitely, in my experience, people liked Americans very much. They're trying to learn English. So a tuk-tuk is a form of transportation throughout Southeast Asia. It's a motorcycle, basically a motorcycle frame with two wheels in back and a little cab with a seat. So the driver sits on a seat, but it's steered like a motorcycle. It has, handlebars for steering. And the tuk-tuk drivers, many of them, are trying to learn English. If you walk around, people will, may stop you and try to engage in conversation so they can practice their English. So, but the people are very sweet. The ones that I've met in general are very sweet. And the young people, it's a very young country because they killed everybody who was older. So, I think the population, I can't remember the statistics, but overwhelmingly at this point under 30. And they don't read, they don't read very much at all. In Myanmar, the taxi cab drivers are all reading as they're waiting for their fares, and there are little booksellers on every corner, with their wares set out on a table or on a cloth on the ground. And it was kind of a shock to go from Cambodia to Myanmar because it pointed out that difference so dramatically. And people are starting to learn to read, but it's not big on reading. And the language it's hard to translate. The concepts that we have in English, which we may transmit with 3-word phrase, will require a paragraph of translation in Khmer. And by the time you're finished translating each word with 2 sentences, it doesn't make any sense at all. Nobody knows what you're talking about. So. I taught a class at the university in hygiene and first aid, and it was amazing because I taught in English, and I kept making it simpler and simpler and simpler until it was just, like literally 3 words on each line. And I would say the 3 words and the translator would talk for a minute. I have no idea what she said. So yeah, it's interesting. It's definitely, it's not, it's not westernized in any sense the way other countries are, but it's interesting. I was thinking about that this last night because the Khmer Rouge did not take away everybody has a bidet. They all have a little squirt thing. I'm sure this is left from the French, so if there is a toilet, and there are a lot of toilets in a lot of places, and most restaurants are fine, and the water is potable in the big cities. May not taste great, but you can drink it. But, you go into the bathroom and you're expected to, wash yourself with this little spray nozzle. And I was thinking, well, that's kind of French. I'm surprised the Khmer Rouge kept that. Maybe they figured people wouldn't, nobody would let them take away their squirt guns. So, fight the battle you can.
I have a question. Can you share some of your background that brought you to become a writer or interested in writing?
Oh, okay. Actually, I was a nurse for 40 years. That has nothing to do with writing, although you do chart notes, but doctors don't want to read novels when you write your note. But my family, I come from a family of writers. One of my great grandmothers wrote a book when she was a missionary in the Turkish Empire in Syria. And, and she wrote several children's books that I remember reading when I was little about what it was like to be a child in a village in Turkey. And that would have been, probably 1890 to 1915. And my mother was a journalist, so she wrote, and I was lucky enough to have an extremely good education. So I did a lot of writing, journaling and poetry and things like that when I was younger, and then stopped completely for years and years. Then I got back into it in my 40s, and I don't know if any of you know Julia Cameron, The Artist's Way. It's a workbook for all kinds of creativity to help you release your inner critic, which is the voice in your head that keeps you from doing whatever it is you want to do. Your critic is going to be very good at convincing you you're going to fail, so you might as well not even try. And every step of the way, they're going to be interfering with whatever you do. So this is a workbook. You're supposed to do it in 3 months. It took me 8 years because I said I was going to, I didn't realize that you didn't have to do it all. A friend of mine who was an artist after, said she makes her living as an artist. And we were talking. I had moved to the West Coast and she lived on the East Coast. So I hadn't seen her for a long time. We were talking, I said something about The Artist's Way. And she said, "Oh, I love that." I said, "Oh, it took me 8 years." She said, "What?" I said, "Well, to do all the exercises." She said, "I didn't do all the exercises. I just did the ones I wanted." I was like, that never occurred to me.
What's the
But I
name of the
recommend-
workbook? I'm
What?
sorry. What's the
What?
name of the workbook? What's the title?
Called, the author is Julia Cameron, Cameron. And actually, some of this information is online. If you do Facebook, I have a Facebook page for Pearl Whitfield and I did a presentation in Cambodia about So You Want to Write a Book. And I posted that presentation on the Facebook page. So Julia Cameron is the author, and The Artist's Way is the name of the book. The basic exercise is to write 3 pages longhand every morning. And you put your pen on the paper, you don't stop, you don't lift your pen up. You just write for 3 pages. It doesn't matter what you write. In fact, it's not about what you write. It's about just letting yourself write. So at first, maybe the first day, the first couple of paragraphs, I said, "Oh, well, I'm excited to be starting this, blah, blah, blah." But pretty soon I was saying, "This is so boring. I hate this. Why am I doing it? On, I hate this. This is so, look, I look, there's a bird outside the window, whatever." But I kept doing it. And the important thing is, at the end of those 3 pages, you don't reread them. You put them in an envelope and you don't look at them again. Because it's not about what you write, it's that you write, and that you practice writing and writing and writing without it mattering what you're writing. So it's a very interesting practice, and that helped a lot. And then I also did some body work. It's like body-based psychotherapy almost. It's called Unlimited Body. And I also did Unlimited Breath. And so both of those are techniques for helping you release blocks that are holding you back from living a more full life. And that was very helpful. So between those 2 things, I was able to sit down with a blank page and write and let myself write without too much judgment. If I find I'm having too much judgment, then I kind of stop and try to refocus, figure it out. I had to self-publish my first book because I knew that I couldn't stand an editor. Now I can edit it. In fact, I've pulled it from the Amazon shelf because I've revised it, and so I'm going to put out a second edition probably this week, or well, probably by the late spring. But I couldn't let anybody else tell me, or I would just, freeze up and not be able. So I had to protect myself when I was writing. I couldn't really share it with anybody.
So your book,
Especially
how far, I'm sorry.
Go
I had
ahead.
another question. How far do you progress with the dancer's life? Like, is it just while she's a dancer, or does the story evolve further than while she was a dancer?
Well, actually, that's a very good question. That reminds me of your other question that I didn't answer yet about the traditional dancing. So I'm going to start with the traditional dancing was basically destroyed during the Khmer Rouge. So there's been a movement. One of the king's sisters has been very involved. The king himself actually was a dancer. He had no interest in being king. He was in Paris dancing, and he was called back. He felt like he needed to come back when his father died. He needed to come back. So he gave up his career and what he loved and came back to be the king in Cambodia. And one of his sisters is also a dancer. And so she's done a lot of research and is bringing back, teaching people. So the Royal Ballet is now doing some of the traditional dances. There's dancing, there's sort of the classic dancing, and then there's kind of village dancing. And so it's coming back, but I don't think anybody really knows. There were 4,000 positions, for the hands and the fingers and the ankles and the arms and the feet and the legs, and each one meant something. And it's kind of like, Thai dancing is similar, and dancing in India, each of the positions that your hand goes into means something. So I don't know how many of those they've recovered. Anyway, so that's the answer to the question about, is the dancing, do they still do it? And you can see, if you go to Cambodia, you can see the dancing being performed. It's slow. It's like, yeah. Then, so yes, the book is about her life. So she starts in the village, and then she walks to Angkor Wat, and and then it's, learning how to be a dancer and other things that happen to her family. Then the king is away when she first gets there, but, so she sees him on occasion. And then as she grows up in the dancer's courtyard, and it's a story of, her friends and things that happen to the different dancers. And I kind of, well, actually, because the Kirkus review actually told the entire plot, which really kind of miffed me, but since it was such a good review, I posted it anyway. And they said, well, you should let us post it. You've got a star. And I was like, okay, that's great. But so she does end up having to stop being a dancer because she goes to the palace to be with the king, and she can't. So some of that, that dynamic of what she gives up in order to be with the man that she loves, and then various things that happen after that, a lot of power dynamics, a lot of, what it's like to be a woman. and what it's like to be a king, you know. So my idea of what it's like to be a king anyway. So I don't know if that answers the question. There's a lot more than. So a lot of it is historically based where possible, working from the stone record.
Do we know historically, if a woman became a dancer, was her family taken care of? Like, was there financial gain?
We
in
don't know
becoming a
anything. We
dancer?
don't know anything about that. Well, if I don't know anything about that.
Mm.
In this case, the only gain the family had was knowing that the child would be fed and taken care of. And then there's a question, okay, so not every village girl who goes to train will be chosen to be a dancer. So what happens to them? You know, you train, but you don't go on to be an adept. You know, what happens to those young women and young men? So a lot of it is my imagination.
Did they have male dancers as well?
Yes, yeah. There are more female, but they do definitely have male dancers. Yeah. The traditional dancing tends to be based on mythology. And it crosses over, it's basically Hindu mythology rather than, well, the Buddhism doesn't really have mythology. So it's, you know, unless the Tibetan Buddhists have mythology, but basically, if you're going to have mythology, it's got to be Hindu. And then the other dances are, you know, wedding dances, but there's not very much information about what there was. So. Can I ask a question of you guys? I see this, I don't know if it's a lithograph or a pen and ink of a dancer that was pulled down and sitting on a chair. How beautiful. Where did you get that? Is that yours?
Yes, it is.
Did you go?
Like a bookseller had these in his shop and sold me 6 different rubbings.
Wow. So those are rubbings. How beautiful.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, there's
Are they from, do you know where they're from?
I guess, Cambodia. It's a Vietnamese, or rather a Vietnam soldier returned with them.
Nice. Wow. Those are spectacular. That's an incredible rubbing. That's a very good example. If everybody could turn it around to show everybody, that's the kind of.
Well, there's a camera that showed it
Oh,
on
okay.
the wall.
Okay. The different carvings, the temples have, I called it a corridor, and I don't know what gallery. There are galleries that are maybe 100 meters long, and they'll have 2 or 3 layers of bas-reliefs carved on each side, on each gallery. So most of the temples have amazing carvings, and some of them are sort of repetitious and some of them aren't. A lot of times the faces on the apsaras, the faces of the dancers, will be different. Garuda, who is one of the main characters in the book, the Hindu eagle man god, is depicted in many different ways. Sometimes he looks more like a man with a beak and wings, and other times he looks more like a bird with just a few human features. So anyway, I find it very, very interesting. And I'm very grateful that I was able to go there And I would recommend, if you get a chance to go to Asia, to take your time and spend a little extra time. You know,
Curly, you have one more question.
okay.
I was wondering what the subject of your first book is.
The first book is completely different. The first book started, I woke up one morning and kind of on my pillow next to me, there was like a little vignette of a little girl, a man who, well, I'll start back. I knew the man's name. There was a man named Ralph, and he had a dog named Rusty, and his wife, whom he loved, had died. He put the dog in the truck, drove around the United States. This is, you know, modern times, and ended up in a little town in the West, bought a mom and pop store, and he's opening the blind in the window of the door on his first day as a storekeeper. And he sees something on the steps, and it turns out to be a really skinny little girl all by herself, about 4 years old. And she doesn't talk. And he'd never had children, but I knew there was something in there. I didn't know what it was. So it's basically the story of his life and the life of the town that he moved to, and the various characters that what, I don't know, probably Canandaigua has a couple of cafes where people go and hang out and talk. And so it's called The Storekeeper, A Tale of Small Town Life. And it's quite long. The revision won't be quite as long, partly because it was my first book and I had a lot of formatting problems, and I'm going to hire professional help so that the gutters aren't as big and the font is not quite as big. And anyway, and you know, we'll pull it together so it's a little more user friendly. But it's just a very sweet story of a small town, life in a small town, and how he enters into the life of a small town, because the storekeeper is kind of the center. And this is a very small town. So without the store, there's not much there. A senior center and a post office and the store and a church, library. So yeah, it's just a sweet story. I keep, you know, I tend to have judgments about my books. I don't know. I leave the book for a long time, and I don't know if the characters are even going to talk to me or if I'll even like the story. And so far, I have. They've talked when I get back to it, and so when I read it again, I'm like, oh, this is really sweet. So you know, it's not. The next book will not be so sweet, I'm sorry to say, or maybe that's good. Aspara in many ways is sweet. The characters, with a few exceptions, are decent people. And in The Storekeeper, most of the there's one character not quite so much, but yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of like, it's fun for me because I don't know what's going to happen. So I just keep writing and keep listening. And yeah, I recorded an audio book of Aspara while I was in Cambodia this year. There's a recording studio. I knew the people there, and I'm going to record The Storekeeper next year when I go. So hopefully I can have those as audiobooks. Got to figure out how to get Audible to, I don't know, buy them, or I don't know. I don't even know what it is that you do. So I have a lot of research. The perils of self-publishing, you know, you're kind of out on a limb by yourself. But any other questions?
Pearl, thank you so much for being here today with us. And did you want to tell everyone how they can get a copy of either one of your books if they're interested?
Oh, sure. They're available on Amazon, and they're not really available by independent bookstores at this time. The Amazon obviously doesn't want to support independent bookstores, and the major retailer Ingram for libraries and bookstores did carry the storekeeper, but isn't carrying Aspara because they can't give the kind of 60-40 split that a bookstore needs. So unfortunately, they're only available on Amazon. They're available as ebooks and as paperbacks. The next time around, the next book I'm going to see about, Ingram now has its own publishing platform, and I mean, I don't know, but one would, I mean, I kind of hate to make an assumption, but you would think that since they distribute to independent bookstores, they might support the independent bookstore to purchase the books, but it's kind of hard to find that information. So I got to do some research about that. So Amazon, but yeah, check out if you're on Facebook. You know, I travel, I did a book tour around the country, 10,000 miles last year, and I came to Canandaigua, which is how I met Alexis. And so I wrote about that. I post pictures and musings. So Pearl Whitfield on Facebook. You kind of have to scroll through a whole bunch of other Pearl Whitfields before you find me, but now you know what I look like. So thank you so much for coming. This has been lots of fun. Okay.
Yeah, I'm in the library and introduce yourself. Well, Pearl actually wrote to me about coming here to do a book talk. And so she came in to the library to do one of those, and then I got to meet her in person, and I got to experience her talking about Aspara, and then I asked her to come back to do book sandwich then, so other people can hear about it. And so I know she was going to be away, but she said that she would be willing to Zoom in so that. Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Have a good day. Keep warm. Happy spring. Bye-bye.
thank you, Pearl.
Okay. Thank you.